out there, as does the Bureau of Land Management. We have jurisdiction over those federal laws and regulations, and the sheriff has the county and state regulations that they enforce out in that area. That's how those jurisdictions operate.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Any questions from the public for these any speakers? We'll have commission. Let's go with public comment, and then we'll have commissioner questions. We need public comment on this issue. I just want to make sure we have public comment on this issue. Seeing none, we'll close public hearing.
I had a question for Mrs.
Okay, now we're commissioner questions. Here we are.
Yeah, I had a question for Mrs. Rockwell. You mentioned that there's kiosk set up there in the gold. How would you get to? You mentioned there's kiosks set up in the Gold Butte area where people can get information.
Mm-hmm.
Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I was up there all day Monday. I drove well over 300 miles from Las Vegas because, you know, actually to get up in the Gold Butte area, you've got to drive about 120 miles to actually get to the Gold Butte area itself. And I'll tell you the truth, I did not see one
Well, we don't
kiosk.
have nearly as many as we'd like to have. Gail? Oh.
Good morning, how are you?
We're in a process right now of developing education and information kiosks for Gold Butte, and Carrie Ronning is working with Clark County to get maps and other types of information on those kiosks. We have some signs up there. We have the roads are all signed as designated. So those kiosks are being developed right now. And Carrie, what's the schedule like in the next?
Those will be installed by July 1st.
By July 1st. So when we have the locations, we have the environmental documentation for those. So we're working real closely with the county Desert Conservation Program to get those up.
Yeah. Well, I had noticed that you moved the boundaries from the old fence line where the Day Ranch is, the old sheep ranch. I don't know if you moved that almost all the way in to Bunkerville. That's correct, right? That's what because you have the new sign there now that says Gold Butte. And always for years I was under the impression that Gold Butte, the start of Gold Butte was always back in there 30 miles further at the fence line where the Day Ranch ended, and then you start into Gold Butte area proper itself. And you still have another 30 miles after that to go to get back into what's left of the old settlement of Gold Butte.
Right, and that has generated a little bit of confusion with the public because Gold Butte is a town site and it's also a cultural area. Yeah. We kind of refer to that entire region as the Gold Butte region. Mm-hmm. It's over 300,000 acres in size and consists of 11 different areas of critical environmental concern. So that sign is just sort of a welcoming to the area in general, and we do plan on putting a more permanent kiosk there to provide information, so more accurate information.
Now, when you do that, and with your present designations, will that go ahead and still limit people and what they can do in way of picnicking or stopping up and see the petroglyphs or hunting or anything of the sort? Or I see it's under consideration as a wilderness area. And generally in wilderness areas, you lose all access. You have to go ahead and be able to walk in there, or there'll be parking places like they've done at Delamars, or what they're planning on doing at Delamars and other areas. You have to park, or like, to use a horrible example, is down in Southern California in the Joshua Tree National Forest. I prospected down there for years looking for old mines and lost treasures, and now I can't do that because you have to hike in, and we're going to face the same problem here, right? We'll have to go ahead to access Gold Butte. We'll have to park, and like a Delamars, we'll have to park and walk in. Is that correct? If it becomes a wilderness area?
Well, I think you're talking, Commissioner, about the possible designation as a national conservation area.
Yes, it's being considered as a wilderness area.
And there has been discussion of a national conservation area with some additional wilderness and then without. And I think it's important for everybody to understand that Congress is the one, I mean, Congress is the legislative branch of the government. Congress is the entity that makes the decision about wilderness and national conservation areas through the passage of law. And when laws like that are passed, then it's our job to figure out how to implement that. And so I, as the BLM district manager, can't say, gee, I'd like to have a national conservation area today. I don't have the authority to do that. That's a congressional mandate, not something that the administrative branch of the government does. Our job is to implement the laws that Congress make.
But Congress is influenced, though, by outside groups, like the 3 groups that started this initially and brought the turtle forward, the tortoise forward as being endangered and threatened and everything, and that's what actually was started the ball rolling, which I don't know if their primary concern was to stop the low-level nuclear plant or stop grazing here so that it becomes more viable to be a wilderness area. I don't know if that's their long-term plans, but I know that Congress can be influenced by people and groups, and that's what they've done in the past. You know, seems to
Well,
be
and all stakeholders, you know, like to be involved in the public process and weigh in with their congressional delegations.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I'm looking here at the judicial authority and all that, you know, I mean, okay, FLIPMA, we've got local sheriff. Good. One thing I do know is this commission does not have jurisdiction over this property. So we do like to talk about, to me, is wildlife. And now I had a question for you, and then maybe I'd have Mr. Bundy. You know, I mean, if this type of wilderness or conservation designation does occur in these areas, and people like him that are developing these waters are forced out, how will that affect wildlife? Will that affect the water developments that sustain the wildlife in the area? Or, I mean, do you have can you throw me out a bone there on that?
Well, there's currently developments there that don't have an authorization, and so everything would have to be looked at on the ground along with NDOW to figure out, you know, what really is best for wildlife and you know, what makes sense. The challenge with water developments are you have to keep them maintained, and that's always an issue. But we would certainly look at each and every one and figure out what made sense for wildlife in that area.
Okay, so then so if they were determined to be beneficial, then the BLM or some other government entity might go ahead and maintain them,
We
possibly.
try to work together with stakeholders and figure out a way to make that happen.
Mr. Bunny, can I ask you, you know, the same thing, you know, if these, I'll just kind of repeat it, if a wilderness or conservation or just a other designation does occur, and, oh, we didn't like your option about jail and things, you know, hey, if you are forced out through whatever purposes, what about the wildlife? What would happen to the wildlife in that area? I mean, you've been there, how many years have you been there, more or less?
All my life, and my family's about 150 years there now.
Okay, so you have some history in the area. And from that, what would your opinion be of what would happen to the wildlife with these water developments that you've created? What's the effect of wildlife?
Okay, if this is turned into a conservation area and a wilderness area, the first thing that happens is the federal government has unlimited power. So we're going to not get to say much. They're going to do what they damn please, let's put it that way. What it would do to me is just limit my operations to where I probably couldn't function.
But wildlife.
And wildlife, I'm probably watering more wildlife than I am cattle by far. And what happens with these desert springs is when you quit maintaining them, the water basically just never comes to surface, and it's not available for even one quail.
So your summation would be that the wildlife would suffer dramatically, especially the quail, and what other species could?
Well, there's the quail and chukars, but also the deer, and then of course you got small game, you know, your rabbits and things like that, which don't use a lot of water. But mainly quail, chukar, and deer, and it'll affect the bighorn sheep.
About how many water developments do you maintain?
Well, I probably maintain, I'd just say 50.
And that's on about how many acres of land?
Well, if you describe it as Gold Butte under,
It's a big area,
as they
okay.
are, it's a big area, what, 300 million acres?
300,000.
300,000 acres. You know, I don't claim rights on all 300,000 acres.
Okay, I'm just trying to figure out where the wildlife stand on the issue. That's where I'm at. Mr. Macbeth.
Ms. Rugwell, thanks for coming.
No problem.
You mentioned the 1998 Resource Management Plan. I was on your website, and it looks like that you're in the process of redoing your Resource Management Plan, and it looks like you've maybe completed the scoping process, and you're in the process now of putting together the plan. And I noted that there is a road access portion to that plan. That's my first question, if I could get a comment on that and where that's going and how that affects the Department of Wildlife and the sportsman stakeholders that we represent. The second one is that on January 28th, I saw that in the Federal Register that it appears that there's going to be a transportation management plan for Clark County. And that obviously is similar to what we've been dealing with in the areas of forest and up north. And so if you could kind of give us a heads up on what is going on there. And I'll tell you that it is absolutely critical. We've talked about the guzzlers. There's quail guzzlers, there's sheep guzzlers. We do need access. We need to get our equipment in there and maintain those facilities. Some of those areas, some of those sheep guzzlers, for instance, are in areas that can't access by vehicles, and so we need helicopter access. And then obviously the sportsmen, to be able to utilize that resource, also need to maintain access for roads and reasonable access for roads and such. So if you could maybe kind of weigh in on those two items, I appreciate it.
You're absolutely correct, Commissioner. We're just really in the early stages of the process of revising the resource management plan. The reason we're having to do that now, typically we would not have engaged in that this soon after completing it in 1998, but some critical things like renewable energy were not considered in 1998. They were not envisioned or analyzed. And so the other thing was there were some decisions that were conflicting in the old plan that needed to be resolved. When you do a resource management plan revision, you often fold some of the decisions from the old one into the new one in order not to have to redo everything. But the bottom line is that it is a public process, and local governments are offered the opportunity to serve as cooperators with us in crafting this. And as I said, we're really early in the process. We have not developed the alternatives yet. We're working on them, but they're not developed. We are getting the memoranda of understanding signed with the local governments right now. And the county will be very heavily involved, particularly the Desert Conservation Program, in working with us as a cooperator. You're also correct in that we are doing what is called recreation area management plans for the Southern Nevada District. That process is just beginning as well. And so these are two efforts that it is crucial that the public get engaged in. Because what we don't want is to not hear from the public and head down a road that's not what people want to see. And what often happens is we'll hold a public meeting, nobody shows up, we continue moving thinking, okay, it's all good, and then we find out, 3/4 to, 11/12 into the process that there's a lot of objection to what we're doing, but we need not only the local governments to be engaged as cooperators, but the public to be engaged.
I guess I would add to that that the Department of Wildlife, the state, can also weigh in on that for their wildlife resources.
And Dow will be a cooperator, I am sure.
Yeah, and I would say that the Clark County Advisory Board would do well to be a part of this process, and like the Elko County Advisory Board does up there. So my point in mentioning this is that all wildlife stakeholders need to be a part of this process, because this is where the decisions are going to be made, and so we need to weigh in on all of this and make sure that our interests are heard. And that's all stakeholders, from ranching to sportsmen to the general public. And so I just noted that in doing my initial research and looking at your website that would look like we were just beginning. And so since you didn't mention it, I thought, let's get it out, and everybody needs to be aware of what's going on, and that we have an opportunity here to weigh in on this, on access issues in Clark County.
Absolutely correct. Thank you.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions before we move on to the next stages? More from the commission? Hi, Mr. Vogler, you had a question?
Mr. Bundy, you don't restrict your water use from any wildlife, do you?
No, when I construct my water, I always try to make it safe for wildlife use. For example, I always put a screen in my, I use the crusher screen. I put it in my water troughs for quail, deer, everything else pretty good shape. But one concern I have, it's not really, is if I shut off a water, what does your wildlife do? That's one thing that I'd like to have resolved someday, you know, because sometimes I don't have water at a trough. But no, I always, my consideration, it don't matter whether I'm a water trough or whether I'm a little spring, I dig the hole bigger and try to make it more access. That's all I can tell you.
Follow up on that. In the 150 years that your family was involved in agriculture in that area, do you have any record of any of your livestock ever eating a desert tortoise?
Well, I do have some records of desert tortoises eating the remains of livestock, but not the other way around.
So, but you were told that you couldn't run livestock as a result of the desert tortoise?
Yeah, there was a full force and effect decision made by the Bureau that livestock wouldn't run in that area.
Based on?
On the desert tortoise being listed as a endangered species or a threatened species.
Are there desert tortoises around Las Vegas?
Yes, there's a lot of them actually. I have data on the Kern River pipeline, which come through the southern state of Nevada, showing there's 7 surveys on the Kern River pipeline done by the bureaus. And what I can tell you real fast what happens there. Where there's cattle, there's about, in a mile stretch, there's about 5 to 7 tortoises in that. And I don't know, the strip was probably, I don't know, maybe 900 foot wide. In a mile, there's 5 to 7 turtles. Where they were sheep and cattle, the number would go up to about 10 to 15. Where there's no sheep or cattle or people, it would go down to 2 or 3. And when you got into Las Vegas Valley, where there was lots of people, sheep, or not, no cows and sheep, but lots of people, dogs, four-wheelers, it's clear up to 50, around 50 tortoises per mile.
Thank you. I have one question for the district manager. I tend to avoid large towns. I'm not used to it, but I do drive into Las Vegas once in a while. Do you consider that any kind of an oxymoron, that on one side of the road, on the Overton turnoff, there's a huge sign that says Coyote Springs on one side of the road, and on the other side of the road it says that this is critical habitat for tortoises? Is that an oxymoron, or am I dreaming here?
Well, I don't know that I would agree with you that it appears strange, but the bottom line is the ACECs were developed in response to the tremendous amount of development that occurred in the Las Vegas Valley, because when you had a lot of development happening in prime tortoise habitat, you had to put additional protections on the amount of habitat that's remaining that's not been developed. And I just, if I may address your point about the cattle don't eat desert tortoise, it's the issue of what livestock can do to the habitat for the desert tortoise. So.
But there are more tortoises where the habitat has had cattle and sheep on, or less.
I'm not a wildlife biologist, sir. I'd have to defer to one of the tortoise experts on that one.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, if that's no other questions, I'd like to thank
Excuse me,
yes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't mean to be premature, but I would like to move that we draft a resolution and send it to all congressional representatives, to Director of Interior Ken Salazar, the Clark County Commissioners, and all appropriate parties to remove the Gold Butte area from being considered now or any time in the future as a wilderness area, conservatory, or wildlands designation. Such a designation would have negative impact on wildlife and wildlife management and deny access to all people, including those who are unable to walk vast distances, such as the handicapped, elderly, and infirmed. Furthermore, such designations would have a negative impact on existing desert flora. Such designation would prevent the maintenance of all water resources and distribution systems upon which all wildlife depends. And if you will, I will draft this resolution and have it signed by you, the chairman of the Wildlife Commission.
So motion on the floor.
I'll second that.
So motion and second on the floor. Okay, I'll get back to my thank yous then after we get all done with this part. Let's see, we need some discussion. Do we have discussion on it at the end, and then we'll get.
My concern, excuse me, my concern is that it perhaps should be placed upon the agenda for a future meeting for a full discussion, and that we request that staff develop a resolution along the lines that he's mentioned. I am sympathetic with that, but I think under the circumstances, it would be best to place it on a future agenda and follow up from there.
Okay, we had Mr. Macbeth had a comment, question.
I want to just echo Commissioner Capro's comment that I think that while I think it's a good idea to weigh in on this issue and communicate with our congressman that not only do we need to discuss it, but the department needs to weigh in on it. So I would agree with that.
Okay, we have any other further discussion on the issue from the commission? Does everybody understand the motion? In that case, we will proceed to vote. All those in favor of the motion, please signify by raising your hand. All right, we have Commissioner Howell, Commissioner Shrum, Commissioner Lent, and Commissioner Vogler in favor. All opposed? We have Mr. Pearl, Mr. Cavan, Mr. Wallace, Mr. Macbeth opposed, and I'll be voting in favor of the motion. So the motion passes 5-4. If we have no further motions on the subject, I'd like to thank the BLM for coming out today. There's been a lot of stuff on this. Appreciate just some really interesting information here. Much appreciated. I'd like to thank the county sheriff for coming out. It's good information on the jurisdiction. We do know that you are in charge. Everybody says so. Mr. Bundy, I know you've got a tremendous amount of time invested in this, and we appreciate you coming out today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's see if we can move right along and hit the next item, which would be, do you want to break for this, gentlemen, or we want to hit number 8? All right, let's have a brief break.
Take a break.
I have to ask Dag on that, but I'm thinking we got to do number 8, then we can move it on to Bear. What else are we going to do? I'll ask Dag here as soon as I get him over here. I'll ask him if we can just. God, worst thing is then that's going to kill us getting anything done. As soon as he gets over here, I'll ask him if we can do. I think we can do 8 and then 12, but he'll tell me in about 3 seconds.
I need some time with you boys.
All right.
Right, Rich?
So
I need some time
we don't
with
have.
this computer.
So can we defer some? Because we're going to end up having to defer some.
I walk through and ask questions.
Because this, This is our next thing. This is pushing an hour. We'll be done just before 3 o'clock on this item. And then can we skip these and go to here, or should we just go to this? Well, all of this, everything here. Being called back to order. We're running a little behind on our agenda here, so I was just referring to the DAG here on what we can do to try to get this moved along. So maybe we can hit item number 8, and then due to time constraints, we could maybe, you said through a motion would be best. If we could have a motion to just move on to number 12 and try to pick up 9 and 10 at the end. Yes. If we can do number 8 now, and then move on to number 12, and then at the end of the agenda, try to pick up 9 and 10. Huh? We can do, I think we can, we're okay to do number, if number 12 starts a little bit late, we're all right, huh? And we'll be, yeah. Okay. Well, as long as it's after 2. Thing was, it's after 2. I think that's where the DAG just told us we're at. Okay. So we have a motion and a second to continue with number 8, and then we'll skip 9 and 10 for now and put them at the end of the agenda, so we can get on to number 12 afterwards. All right. Everybody understand the motion? All in favor signify by stating aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion passes 8-0. Okay, number 8.
For the record, Larry Gilbertson, Nevada Department of Wildlife. The last time we were able to show the model to this group was a couple of years back when we had some intense interest on the elk population relative to our modeling and how it worked with the elk population, and it was very instructive. And we've got a lot of new commissioners and new county game board members. We're really pleased to be able to present this item today. And I'd like to give a little background so that people can understand the evolution of the modeling process and appreciate it more. Essentially, before 1975, there wasn't as much need to do deer population estimates because mostly the seasons in the 60s and those types of things were either sex seasons and antlerless quotas on top of that. Tags were sold over the counter and that sort of thing. And some of the early population estimates that were done, I remember reading a Nevada Outdoors magazine, and Larry Barngover, who was a biologist in Ely years ago, talked about harvest representing a percentage of the population. So in the old days, some of the population estimates that people see were that simple and straightforward, that studies in the West, and we always collaborate with other Western states on deer management, and they would come up with a calculation of some sort that the harvest in those types of seasons in those days represented a percentage of the population. And so if they thought the harvest represented 10%, you simply could multiply by 10 and come up with an estimate. In 1975, we went to, in the mid-70s, we switched to total quotas for the entire state. And at that point, the department needed to do one of two things. We either needed population estimates so that we would have real numbers to use to calculate quotas commensurate with the ability of the population to provide that harvest, or one of the methods, and it's used in other states in the past and probably still is a little bit, but you could look at the long-term average harvest at that point. So in the mid-70s, we could have looked at a 10 or 20-year average harvest that was coming out of most management areas and applied a hunter success rate to that. So we could have started that way, that simply, and realized that, over the long term, this area is able to provide a certain level of harvest, and it's safe because it's a long-term average. And we could have done that, but instead, we decided as a department, because we collect data, and a lot of it, and we also implemented helicopter surveys in those days, that we would go ahead with population estimates. And so, for those of you who love algebra, the first population estimate technique we had was, again, as we're collaborating with other Western states, we had a Mr. Selleck and a Mr. Hart who put together what was called the Selleck-Hart change in ratio population estimate technique. And basically it was just solving for X. All the states collect various data, age and sex composition data of deer herds. And so we know buck ratios and fawn ratios and those types of things. And from those, you can look at spring recruitment and you can predict what a buck ratio might be pre-season. And then, so you knew a pre-season buck ratio, then we measured harvest, and Nevada had a really good process of harvest report. Nevada was one of the leading states in getting more return data. Many, many states did 10% questionnaires, phone questionnaires. We started that way, but we were one of the first states to make it mandatory and to have build up to 60 and 70 to 80 and then 90% plus harvest reports. So we've had excellent data. And we're able to use the change in ratio method by solving for X, figuring out how many bucks were out there based on what that harvest did to a buck ratio change. So using that methodology, it's a little more complicated than that because there are other factors that were accounted for besides the straight algebra. You had other considerations, and you'd remove some animals that you monitored or road kills or various things you could also add into the formula for that. And then when it came into the computer world, the Department of Wildlife in the mid to late 80s started buying computers, but not for everyone. And so, because we're not a rich agency, never were, we got a few computers here and there, and people started learning how to use computers. And once we got enough computers, we just simply used Quattro Pro to make the change in ratio a computer program. You simply put it into a spreadsheet in a computer. And we used that for a number of years. And then as we got more computers, we looked around the West, and again, in collaboration, and found there was a gentleman named Mr. Bartholomew who was putting together what's pretty well known as POP2. And it's a life table spreadsheet model. And we purchased that. And so our techniques evolved into a new system from algebra to a life table. And you'd probably like that, Commissioner Macbeth, because it's more of an accounting type where you can, and that's what we've evolved into. And that process, or that model, some of the problems we had with that one is that when we got to the 92-93 big winter and had a big die-off in the state of Nevada, that was weather-related, and we actually went out and saw lots of deer out in the field that had died, so we knew there was a big die-off. And if you took that model, it had only one place at the time to put mortality rates in there. And if you put the mortality rates in there to show that die-off, that model became what we referred to as a killing model, because it had to knock that deer herd down to show that big decrease. And once you did that, you couldn't do anything to it to turn it around and make it show an increase afterwards. And so POP2 was kind of limited that it had, you could show a population that would kind of went up and kind of went down and was kind of flat. Or you could show a growing population or a decreasing population. And we actually worked with the man who developed it, and he was trying to make changes and adjustments, and some of us were actually on his list, and he would send the new version to us, and we'd run real data through it and let him know some of the problems we were still having. Well, finally, Mike Cox, who's our big game staff specialist, became frustrated that we just couldn't get it to really work in all situations and all instances. So Mike has developed a spreadsheet model that he's going to go through today and show you where this process of population estimation has evolved. And I guess I'd just like to relate one quick story. In the 80s, right about the good old days when we were having lots of deer and lots of tags, I had a supervisor who sent me to I won't say which one, but another state in the West to see how their process worked. And I was a little intimidated because I was classifying, 4,000 or 5,000 deer. Sometimes one spring I got over 8,000 deer. And so I had a pretty good sample, and I felt good about that. And I was making decisions on a sample size like that. And so I'm thinking, well, this state, they put more people in the field than we had deer in the state of Nevada. And so I'm thinking, I'm going to learn some really good tricks because this state really has a deer resource. And I went to the meeting, and it was a meeting like this, and two biologists got up and they said, well, what we did this year is we went on our mortality survey, and this year we counted 13 dead deer instead of 17 dead deer. And we recommend the quota to go from 250 does up to 400 does. And everybody said fine, and they did that. And I just walked out of that meeting and came home and was like, if I tried that in Nevada, they would have tarred and feathered me and sent me away, because we've had the luxury of, in Nevada, of surveying most of our mountain ranges and collecting data. And so our biologists know so much more. I guess we're held to a higher standard. And so, but it made me know how lucky I was to be able to work in Nevada and have that luxury or ability to go out and look at the resource each and every year with a helicopter and get huge sample sizes and really understand and know what's going on. So with that, I'd like to have Tony come down. Tony back? Come on down. And we'll start. Tony will give a little background on survey and before the modeling process starts, and then Mike will go through the modeling.
These screens on the side will have about a dozen slides in a PowerPoint. Laser pointer forward. Basically, Larry alluded to the fact that in 1975, 1976, we started the limited draw system. Everything was on a draw basis only, about the same point in time as when we started helicopter surveys. We have approximately 35 years of helicopter data for most of our big game species. What I'd like to do here is kind of take us from that 1976 forward and talk about what we're doing today. I'll go through this pretty quick in the interest of time, but the overall process, Larry kind of alluded to it, is we start with the survey and inventory. From the survey and inventory, we go to a population modeling. The data for the modeling comes directly from the survey and inventory, and then from the modeling we develop arrays and we recommend quotas that undergo the scrutiny of the public process. Harvest data enters into this process in two areas. Harvest data is entered directly into the modeling. Those animals, that's one of the benefits of having mandatory reporting, is you can actually remove the animals from the population. That's the hunter questionnaire data. And then also harvest data is used in the development of the arrays and the quota recommendation. For today, I'm going to focus on the survey and inventory aspects. We'll go through it fairly quickly, and then Mike will discuss the population model and possibly use some examples. So with respect to survey and inventory, what do we survey? All of our big game species, with the exception of mountain lions, are surveyed in some way, shape, or form. Pronghorn, bighorn, mountain goats, elk, and mule deer. How do we do it? Varies a little bit by species. Some differences in the biology of each species that require us to do it a little bit differently. For the pronghorn, we use a lot of ground surveys. Ground surveys are typically done via pickups, and you might have 2 or 3 biologists canvass a valley, communicating via radio back and forth, trying to get as good a look at those animals as possible to classify them by age and gender. And then in other areas where ground surveys just aren't feasible, areas that have inaccessible areas, we can do it from the air. Historically, some of these were done with fixed-wing aircraft, but at this point, anything done from the air for pronghorn is done via helicopter. Bighorn, mostly helicopter, and then we also use some hunter observations. Mountain goat, also via helicopter, and we also get hunter observations when hunters check their animals in after harvest. Elk done via helicopter, and mule deer done via helicopter, and on some occasions can be augmented via ground surveys. Try to be a little bit careful with the augmentation via ground surveys, because sometimes no data is better than bad data, and if you go out, you're used to sampling a couple thousand animals in an area. If you go out and you have limited access and you come in with 200 animals, that data may or may not be an accurate representation of what actually exists in the population. When do we survey? Variable, again, based partly on the biology of the animal. Pronghorn, fall or winter. The benefits of doing it in the fall, it allows us to better determine mature bucks from yearling bucks. The benefit in the winter is that you have larger concentrations and you can potentially improve your efficiency. Bighorn variable, some of the populations in the south are more limited by water and high temperatures in the summer, whereas populations in the north, the California and Rocky subspecies, can be more limited by winter conditions, winter habitat. So it's best to try to survey those populations after a time where you can have reasonable confidence in the recruitment value, what you're seeing out there in terms of lambs, and those lambs are officially recruited into those populations, having made it through the bottleneck event. Mountain goats, we've tried them in the summer, we've tried them in the winter. We typically have better concentrations in the winter on wind-blown slopes, a little bit more efficient. Elk, the beauty of elk is they don't shed their antlers as early as mule deer do. Elk will have their antlers well into March, sometimes not even shedding into April. So at the same time we're obtaining a bull ratio, we can also get a calf ratio. So we can do a single survey for elk in the winter. Mule deer, ideally we like to do 2 surveys in the fall, preferably the peak of rut, to obtain the buck ratio, and then in the spring to get your recruitment, your spring fawn ratio. Where do we do the surveys? We try to do them in as much of the area, the hunt area, as logistically possible, but however, in an effort to increase efficiency, oftentimes concentration areas are used, assuming that the concentration occurs at a time that still allows for accurate classification. And when I say that, we're just, again, talking about whether it's pronghorn shedding their horns, or deer or elk losing their antlers. Who does the surveys? The area biologist collects all the data for each species in their area, and they utilize the data in their modeling process. Biologists will rely on other biologists in the region or biologists from adjacent areas to assist with those surveys. There's several benefits to that, and that it's kind of a professional development where people that have been doing it for a while can help new biologists, and it also is good in terms of consistency. It's a cross-check where biologists can make sure that their classification schemes are consistent across areas. What data is collected with pronghorns? Basic classification: a buck, a mature buck, yearling buck, does and fawns. Bighorn sheep, rams are classified by age class, ewes and lambs. Mountain goats, we just do adults to kids. We use an adult to kid ratio because of the difficulty in discerning billies from nannies, especially at 100 knots at 11,000 feet. Elk, bulls are classified by point class, cows and calves. And the mule deer, the bucks, are also classified by point class, and does and fawns. A lot of information on this slide. Follow me if you will. Buck ratios. The value of a buck ratio for mule deer is it allows for verification of the population size. It's a way that we can true the model, we can cross-check the magnitude, the estimated magnitude of the population. For example, if we just take a mock population that's estimated at 1,000 animals, and we know the observed values, we had, for example, 30 bucks for 100 does and 40 fawns. Just by simple math, that tells us that there should be somewhere in the neighborhood of 176 bucks for 589 does and 235 fawns. Therefore, if we remove a known number of bucks, we can predict the resulting buck ratio. For example, a removal of 30 bucks through harvest should result in an observed buck ratio of 25. So we compare that observed buck ratio to the predicted buck ratio, and if the observed ratio is actually higher than what we predicted, the population is likely underestimated, and if a lower ratio is observed, the population is likely overestimated. So that fall survey, the peak of rut, getting the most accurate buck ratio possible allows us to true the model, testing the magnitude of the population. And then the fawn ratios from the spring allow for verification of the population trend. Spring fawn ratios, which really is a recruitment value, we talk about recruitment, is what drives a population, and consequently what drives the model. And as Mike introduces a model and goes through that, hopefully that'll be evident. So in the absence of a spring fawn ratio, the trend of the population, up, down, status quo, cannot be adequately or consistently determined. So depending on the population, depending on your confidence in the magnitude of the estimate, depending on the confidence in the trend, different areas may benefit more from a fall survey versus a spring survey. And these data aren't the only data that we use to evaluate the population estimates. We have a whole host of data, not the least of which is hunter success, percent 4-point or better, sample size, catch per unit effort, the amount of time that we spend to get that sample size. So there's a number of factors. These are some of the basics. And if we look at some mule deer data, since 1976 in Area 10, we've classified over 20,000 groups of deer representing nearly 400,000 individual animals. Each group has a makeup of bucks, does, and fawns, and has a spatial attribute indicating exactly where it was observed. Prior to about 10 years ago, it was a township range and section, so it was likely within a half mile, which you're talking about 2,500 feet. For the last 10 years, we've been using GPS technology in the helicopter, and it's allowed us to mark exactly where these groups are encountered. Data are summarized by unit, and classification totals are utilized in the modeling process for all of these species. There's any questions on the survey and inventory aspect of it, I'd be glad to take those, and Mike will show you how this data is then taken and incorporated into the modeling process.
Do we have any questions on, we're going to hold them till later. Go ahead.
I just had a quick question. Are you going to continue to do fall surveys in all the areas now?
I believe so. It's my intent, my hope that what we can do is we can prioritize our areas on an as-needed basis and try to be as effective and efficient as possible with our air operations, and help us to understand as accurately as possible what our populations, what the levels that they exist at and the trends.
I had one other question, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
When you classify these, you use the hunter report card, right? For results, hunting results?
We use the hunter questionnaire data for harvest.
For harvest?
Yeah.
How do you rank, there's always people that put in there 100 points or 500 points or don't answer it. How do you rate the hunters that send that kind of survey? What are you told to report if somebody puts in, I got a shot of deer with 100 points? What do you put that in as a point class, or what do you do with that?
I personally haven't seen an example where somebody they harvested a 100-point buck down, but I will tell you there are some errors certainly, and those errors, when they're as glaring and obvious as that, would probably warrant withholding that from the analysis. And I think it really depends on the area that you're looking at. If you have an area with a really small quota and you have a high error in reporting, then that's likely to influence the resulting harvest more than if you had an area, for example, like Area 10, where you might have several hundred, 1,600 deer harvested, and you have 24 people misreport. But there's a certain element of error in having hunters self-report. The question is that error large enough to alter the data, alter the result? And is that error consistent from year to year? Because if it's consistent from year to year, then the modeling process, it should be accounted for. But if it's in a different direction and of significant magnitude, then it should probably be addressed.
Questions, Mr. Trump?
I have a question. Could you tell me, is Nevada's deer numbers as numerous as, say, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and the Idaho mule deer?
No, Nevada has approximately 1/5 the deer that Colorado and Idaho has, and approximately 1/3 what Utah has.
Is there any reason for that, or do we?
Absolutely. There's a number of reasons, not the least of which is that Nevada is the driest state in the union. We don't have nearly the habitat resources, the habitat quality. That's not a new phenomenon. That's a long-standing phenomenon.
Could we throw predators in there too? Say, for instance, mountain lions. Could we throw mountain lions in there into the mix? and say,
We could do that. We could go back 100 years and we could easily find a time where we had neither lions or deer in Nevada.
Neither lions nor deer. Other questions of Mr. Vogler?
I picked some statistics up out of the Elko, and I was just wondering, we always talk about habitat. In the state of Nevada, in 1934, there were 312 deer harvested. We had a bad winter in 48 and 49, had a hay lift. And then they had another bad winter in 1951 and 52, which caused another hay lift. In 1956, Elko County issued 32,500 tags. Sage hens used to have a 30-day hunting season, 6 per day, 12 in possession. Fire has always been part of habitat. Is there any chance that there's some other influence besides in the habitat? For example, since the Taylor Grazing Act was instituted in 1934, in the state of Nevada, 90% of the sheep are now gone, and over 50% of the cattle are gone. And we're still talking about habitat. But the peak years in this area was when there was extremely unrestricted hunting and a good deal more livestock. Is there any other factor in habitat, not just...
There's a whole host of factors that...
Could predation have anything to do with that?
It certainly could be one of many factors. You know, we can play speculative cause and effect games, you know, for a long time, but, you know, we can also say that let's look at the last 5 years of the 60s and the supposed good old days, and we can see that Nevada harvested more bucks in 1994, 1997 than any of the last 5 years of the 60s, which...
Recorded harvest, because that was before they had the
yeah, there's
mandatory
some expanded questionnaire. I'm not discounting that predators play a role, but I think that, you know, speculative cause and effect type relationships can be dangerous.
But you also mentioned Utah, and Utah has a bounty on coyotes. They have really ratcheted up.
We are second only to Utah in terms of resources expended, predator control activities.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right. Other questions on this aspect? We'll have a chance later, I'm sure, but, okay. Go ahead and finish, continue with presentation.
Thank you. Mike Cox, Nevada Department of Wildlife. Before I jump into the actual population models on the computer, wanted to go over just some basics of our modeling process. So why do we need to estimate numbers? We need to try to be able to discern the status of the herds. We can look at harvest alone. We could look at recruitment rates alone, but they may not give us the full picture. So we need to try to look at the entire population. It gives us, our biologists, an opportunity to evaluate some of the dynamics of those big game herds and what makes them tick. And Tony had alluded to earlier, our quota process with the way it's set up really demands that we have an estimate of the male-female portion of the herds so we can determine surplus or safe quotas. So what really is a population model? And the type of model that we use, just some very basic algebraic equations that reconstruct the actual herd that is out there over time in terms of the males and the females, the young of the year, and the dynamics that they go through on an annual basis. equations are trying to represent the relationships and influences that key parameters have on those animals. And the two things that wild populations do is they go up and they go down. And so these equations attempt to emulate and represent those. With every year that we collect data, and Tony said we've been collecting some really good data since 1976 from the air and even longer with harvest, we have a better ability to validate and calibrate or true our models because what you had 10 years ago has a huge influence of what you have today. It's all interconnected. And actually, there are several states, their population estimating processes are, they're started new every year. So there's no connection to their estimate from one year to the next because they're using siteability models. And I think ours is much more superior because it's based on the previous status of that herd. So if they took a hit a decade ago or even 2 years ago, that's going to influence what their ability to grow or maintain themselves in the present. And really, when you boil down any wildlife population, but certainly our big game, you're looking at four main things. Animals are born, animals die, and you don't always have closed populations such that you have animals moving back and forth into a population and out of a population. And you can just think of that as just a checkbook with taking money out and putting it back in and trying to account for all that. Some of the key parameters that the model is estimating is fecundity, or the number of young that are born per female, adult female, the sex ratio at birth, natural mortality rates. I'm not going to get into why those mortalities occurred. We're just trying to track all other non-harvest mortality. And obviously, again, Tony talked and Larry talked that we have probably one of the best reporting programs in the West. So we have a really good handle on known hunter harvest. Wounding loss, we take our best shot at wounding loss that is associated with all those hunting seasons. Surveys, again, the male ratios and the young ratios I'll show are very critical to accuracy of estimating the herds in Nevada. And in some populations like bighorn sheep, we actually have known removal or transplants of animals into certain herds. And this is just probably hard to see, but we're actually tracking a cohort through time. In this case is 1990 through 2002, and again, every year we build upon our knowledge of what each age class is doing and the dynamics that are occurring, whether they're growing or declining. Just a real quick overview of how our model works. In this case, you've got 5 age classes. The youngest is the young of the year, or a fawn for a mule deer population. And in a given year, we're going to subject that population to mortality, or we'll account for that with a survival rate from 0 to 100%. And then the resultant number of animals in each age class is the following year's age class or cohort, with everyone having a birthday. We also are accounting for the young of the year that are born to those animals that are old enough to give birth. And then that feeds back into the new age class of calves or fawns or whatever. Lots of checks and balances in the model to help us maintain the accuracy of what's really happening on the ground. Again, the buck ratios, the bull ratios of known harvest, or excuse me, on survey, the buck ratios per 100 does or bull ratios can be a really key component. The male harvest, especially when there's known age. Our sample size, we use that a lot, especially in bighorn sheep herds, to help confirm our modeling efforts. And we get a lot of good field observations of sportsmen and the general public that we also utilize in ground truthing or checking and balancing our models. And all that previous years of data will help us discern whether we're accurate or not. Next, I want to actually open up the model and kind of show you how it runs. The screen resolution is a little weak, so you may not be able to see all the idiosyncrasies of everything there. Computer to the video. So try to increase the resolution size. So the development of the model was in Quattro Pro, and now we moved into Excel. It's a reconstructed model. We are reconstructing the actual cohorts by season as best as we can. So there's multiple sheets within any particular population model. This happens to be a mule deer model, but they're very similar for Area 6. This is the survey page. And again, I'm seeing what you're seeing, and it's hard to read the numbers. But on the left side is year. We actually have this particular model starts in 1976 and is through 2010. So this is the survey page. Tony talked about how we collect data, and so we're actually, our biologists, they enter all their survey data by point class and by gender and age, young of the year and adults, into the spreadsheet. And it provides us with the buck ratios and the fawn ratios. And for mule deer, we attempt to survey both in the fall and also in the spring. So we're looking at fecundity of what's hitting the ground and surviving for a few months in the fall, and then ultimately what is being recruited in the spring. So all that data goes directly from the biologist's data sheets into the model. And without hunt questionnaire data, we would be having a difficult time to discern the accuracy of these models, as Tony talked about in that example of 1,000 animals. If you collect a certain amount of bucks in your survey, so you have a ratio of males to females, and you know what the harvest numbers were, the real, not just a rate, but the number of bucks and does harvested, then that removal from your population can help us determine the magnitude of that herd. There has to be so many females that gave birth. There has to be so many fawns that survived to 1, 2, 3, 4 years of age to allow for those bucks to be harvested by a certain point class or age. So we put in